The frozen wind howled with such fury that Margaret Sullivan could no longer feel her fingers gripping the reins, and somewhere in the white chaos around her, she realized with creeping terror that she had lost the trail completely. She had left Hawthorne, Montana that morning with clear skies overhead and confidence in her ability to reach the neighboring ranch before nightfall. The letter in her saddlebag promised employment as a governess for the Whitmore family, 20 miles east of town. It was December 1885, and Margaret needed this position desperately. Her father's debts had consumed everything after his death 3 months prior, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a horse she could barely afford to feed. But the weather in Montana had no regard for desperate women or their plans. The blizzard had rolled in from the north like a white avalanche, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien wasteland within minutes. Margaret's mare, Daisy, whinnied nervously as snow accumulated on her dark mane. The animal's distress only amplified Margaret's own mounting panic. "Easy, girl," Margaret tried to say, but her lips were so numb the words came out slurred. She could barely see 3 feet in front of her face. The wind cut through her wool coat as if it were made of paper, and her fingers had long since stopped responding to her commands. She knew she was in serious trouble. Daisy stumbled, and Margaret nearly pitched forward out of the saddle. Her hands scrambled for purchase, but her frozen fingers wouldn't cooperate. She managed to stay mounted through sheer luck, her heart hammering against her ribs. If she fell now, if she lost Daisy in this storm, she would die. It was that simple. Time became meaningless. Margaret drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes certain she was still moving forward, other times unsure if she had been traveling in circles. The cold had moved beyond pain into something worse, a deep numbness that felt like sleep calling her name. She knew that was dangerous. Her father had told her stories of men who had frozen to death in winter storms, how they often felt warm and peaceful at the end, how they simply lay down in the snow and never got up. She wouldn't lie down. She couldn't, but her body seemed to have other ideas. Her spine couldn't hold her upright anymore, and she slumped forward against Daisy's neck, barely conscious. The world tilted. Voices echoed from somewhere far away, or maybe they were just in her head. Strong hands gripped her arms. She tried to protest, tried to fight, but her body wouldn't obey. Someone was lifting her down from the saddle. The cold intensified briefly as she was moved through the storm, and then suddenly there was shelter from the wind. Warmth. Impossible, blessed warmth. Margaret's eyes fluttered open to find herself in a rough wooden building, illuminated by the orange glow of a fire. A barn, she realized distantly. She was lying on a pile of hay covered with what felt like several heavy blankets. Her coat had been removed, and someone was rubbing her hands vigorously. "Stay awake," a deep male voice commanded. "Don't you dare fall asleep on me." Margaret's vision slowly focused on the man kneeling beside her. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with dark hair dampened by melted snow and sharp features set in concentration. His brown eyes flicked up to meet hers, and she saw relief flash across his face. "There you are," he said. "Thought I might have found you too late. Who are you?" Margaret managed to whisper through chattering teeth. "Name's Jacob Garrett. This is my ranch, or the barn of it anyway. We need to get you to the house, but I had to warm you up first. Can you feel your fingers and toes?" Margaret tried to assess her extremities. Pain was beginning to replace the numbness, which the man, Jacob, seemed to take as a good sign when she winced. Good. Pain means the blood is flowing again. What in God's name were you doing out in this weather? "It wasn't like this when I left town," Margaret protested weakly. "The storm came out of nowhere." "Montana storms will do that," Jacob said grimly. You're lucky your horse had more sense than you did. She was heading straight for my barn when I spotted you both. Another 15 minutes and you would have been a frozen statue." "My horse," Margaret said, trying to sit up. "Is she all right?" Jacob pressed her back down gently but firmly. "Your mare is fine. I got her into a stall with feed and water. Right now I'm more concerned about you. Can you stand?" With his help, Margaret managed to get to her feet, though her legs shook like a newborn calf's. Jacob kept one strong arm around her waist, taking most of her weight without complaint. "The house is about 50 yards from here," he said. "Storm's still bad, but we can make it if you hold on to me. Keep your face tucked against my shoulder." Margaret nodded, too cold and exhausted to be embarrassed by the intimate necessity. Jacob wrapped her back in her coat, then pulled his own heavy jacket tighter. He opened the barn door just wide enough for them to slip through, and the blizzard immediately tried to rip them apart. True to his word, Jacob held her steady. Margaret buried her face against his shoulder as instructed, one arm wrapped around his waist while his arm remained locked around her. They moved forward into the howling white, and Margaret simply trusted this stranger to lead her to safety. The journey felt eternal, but finally, Jacob was pulling her up steps and through a door. The wind slammed it shut behind them with enough force to rattle the windows. Margaret found herself in a small but well-built ranch house, warm air washing over her like a blessing. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace, and oil lamps illuminated a combination living area and kitchen that spoke of masculine practicality more than any feminine touch. "Sit here," Jacob said, guiding her to a chair near the fire. He disappeared briefly and returned with more blankets, which he wrapped around her shoulders. Then he went to the kitchen area and began working at the stove. Margaret watched him through heavy-lidded eyes. Now that they were inside and she could see him properly, she noticed he was tall and lean, with the muscled build of a man who worked hard for his living. His clothes were well-worn but clean, practical ranch wear. There was a quietness to his movements, an efficiency that spoke of a man used to living alone. "How far is your ranch from town?" Margaret asked, her voice still shaky. "About 12 miles south of Hawthorne," Jacob replied without turning around. "I run cattle, though not as many as some of the bigger outfits. It's just me out here most of the time. I've got a couple of hands who come help during roundup and branding, but winters I manage alone." "Aren't you lonely?" Jacob glanced back at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Sometimes, but loneliness is better than bad company. I learned that the hard way." He brought her a tin cup filled with something hot. "Careful," he warned. "It's just hot water with a little honey and whiskey, nothing fancy, but it will warm you from the inside." Margaret accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her stiff fingers around it. The warmth felt like heaven. She took a cautious sip and felt the liquid burn a pleasant path down her throat. "Thank you," she said softly. "You saved my life." "Just lucky I happened to be checking the barn when I was," Jacob said, settling into a chair across from her. "What were you doing out there alone? No offense, but you don't strike me as a rancher or a settler." "I was on my way to a position as a governess," Margaret explained. "The Whitmore family, about 20 miles east of Hawthorne." Jacob's eyebrows rose. 20 miles? You would have never made it in this storm. Hell, you weren't even headed in the right direction when I found you. The Whitmore place is northeast, and you were going almost due south. Margaret felt her face flush with embarrassment and residual fear. "I got turned around in the snow. I couldn't see anything. Like I said, lucky." Jacob stood and moved back to the stove. "You hungry? I've got stew left from dinner." Margaret's stomach answered before she could, growling loudly enough that Jacob chuckled. "I'll take that as a yes." As he prepared food, Margaret looked around the house more carefully. It was a single large room divided by function rather than walls. The sleeping area was in one corner, with a simple bed covered in quilts. The kitchen area took up another corner, with a good iron stove and shelves stocked with supplies. The living space where she sat held the fireplace, a few chairs, a small table, and shelves lined with books. That surprised her. She hadn't expected a solitary rancher to be a reader. Jacob handed her a bowl of stew and a spoon, then sat down with his own portion. The food was simple but good, rich with meat and vegetables. Margaret ate ravenously, her body crying out for fuel to replace what it had burned trying to keep her alive in the cold. "This is very good," she said between bites. "My mother's recipe," Jacob said. "About the only thing I remember from her cooking lessons that actually stuck. She died when I was 15. Cancer took her slow. I'm sorry. Long time ago now." Jacob ate in silence for a moment. "What about your family? They know where you were headed today." Margaret's throat tightened. "I don't have any family left. My father died 3 months ago, lung fever. He left debts that consumed everything we had. I've been staying at the boarding house in Hawthorne, taking in mending and washing to pay my room, but it isn't enough. When I heard the Whitmores needed a governess, I jumped at the chance. I need the position desperately." Jacob studied her face, his expression softening. "I'm sorry about your father, that's a hard thing." "Yes," Margaret agreed quietly. "He was a good man, just unlucky. He tried his whole life to make something of himself, but it seemed like every venture failed. In the end, he was convinced he was cursed. Doesn't sound like he was cursed, just sounds like life happened to him, same as it happens to all of us." Jacob collected their empty bowls and set them aside. "Storm's not letting up. You'll have to stay here tonight. Maybe tomorrow too, depending on how long this lasts. I've got the bed, you take it. I'll sleep out here by the fire." Margaret started to protest. "I couldn't take your bed, you've already done so much." "Not arguing about this," Jacob said firmly. "You nearly froze to death an hour ago. You need proper rest. The bed's yours." Too exhausted to fight, Margaret nodded. Her eyes were already drooping despite her best efforts to stay awake. Jacob helped her to the bed, which was surprisingly comfortable. The quilts were heavy and warm, and the pillow smelled faintly of soap and something else. Something masculine and not unpleasant. Margaret was asleep almost before her head settled into it. She woke once during the night, disoriented and briefly panicked until she remembered where she was. Through the dim light, she could see Jacob's form in the chair by the fire, wrapped in a blanket. He appeared to be asleep, his head tilted back, his breathing deep and even. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in a soft orange glow. Margaret felt a strange flutter in her chest as she watched him. This man had saved her life, taken her into his home without hesitation, given up his own bed for her comfort. She knew nothing about him beyond his name and his basic kindness, but she found herself wanting to know more. The thought surprised her. Margaret had never been particularly interested in romance. Her father's struggles had consumed most of her life, leaving little room for courtship or girlish daydreams. At 23, she had resigned herself to spinsterhood, assuming that ship had sailed. Yet something about Jacob Garrett stirred something in her she hadn't expected to feel. She closed her eyes and drifted back to sleep, the sound of the wind outside contrasting with the safety she felt within these walls. Morning arrived gray and still angry. Margaret woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, blinking sleep from her eyes to find Jacob already up and cooking breakfast. The windows revealed that the storm continued its assault, perhaps slightly less intense than the night before, but still far too dangerous for travel. "Good morning," Jacob said when he noticed she was awake. "How are you feeling?" Margaret sat up carefully, assessing her body. She was stiff and sore, but the dangerous numbness from yesterday was gone. Much better, thank you. Still a bit cold, but nothing like yesterday. Good. Come eat something. We're stuck here for today at least, maybe tomorrow too. These big storms usually blow themselves out in a couple of days. Margaret joined him at the small table, accepting a plate of bacon and eggs with gratitude. You don't have to keep feeding me. I don't want to deplete your winter stores. I've got plenty, Jacob assured her. Stocked up good back in October. Besides, not like I can go anywhere to buy more right now, even if I needed to. They ate in comfortable silence for a while before Margaret asked, "How long have you had this ranch?" 5 years. Bought the land cheap after the previous owner went bust. Spent the first 2 years just getting the house and barn into decent shape. Started small with the cattle, building the herd up slow. It's been hard work, but it's mine. Nobody can take it from me as long as I pay my taxes and don't do anything stupid. You don't ever want a partner, someone to share the work. Jacob's expression shuddered slightly. Had a partner once, didn't work out. Margaret sensed she had touched on something painful. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry. It's all right. Jacob pushed his food around his plate. Her name was Rebecca. We were engaged, set to be married 4 years ago. Then she met a man from back east, someone with money and prospects. She decided a struggling rancher wasn't good enough for her. Can't say I blame her entirely. This is a hard life, especially for a woman. That must have hurt terribly. It did at the time, but I've made my peace with it. Some people aren't cut out for this life, and it's better to find that out before the wedding than after. He looked up at Margaret. What about you? No sweetheart waiting for you in town? Margaret shook her head. No one. I spent the last 5 years caring for my father as his health declined. There wasn't time or opportunity for courtship. Most of the eligible men in Hawthorne are either minors or drifters, and neither type appealed to me. You're educated, Jacob observed. I can tell by the way you speak. My mother was a school teacher before she married my father. She taught me to read and write, insisted I get a proper education. She died when I was 12, but by then she had given me a love of books and learning. It's why I thought I would make a good governess. You'll still get your chance at that job, Jacob said. Soon as this storm clears and it's safe to travel, I'll take you to the Whitmore place myself. Make sure you get there in one piece. You would do that, of course. Can't save you from freezing just to let you get lost again. There was warmth in his voice, something almost teasing. Margaret found herself smiling. I suppose that would be poor planning on your part. The day passed slowly. The storm raged on outside, occasionally rattling the windows with particularly strong gusts. Jacob tended to his livestock, making dangerous trips to the barn to ensure his horses and the handful of cattle he kept close to the house had food and water. Each time he left, Margaret found herself anxious until he returned, snow-covered but safe. While he was outside, Margaret made herself useful by tidying the house and preparing meals. She found a sense of peace in the domestic tasks, a normalcy that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the previous day. Jacob's home might be rough and masculine, but it was clean and well organized. He clearly took pride in what he had built here. In the afternoon, they sat by the fire and talked. Margaret learned that Jacob had grown up on a ranch in Wyoming, that he had 2 younger sisters who had both married and moved to California with their husbands. He loved horses, preferred coffee to tea, and had a dry sense of humor that emerged once he relaxed. Jacob learned that Margaret loved poetry, could speak a little French, and was terrified of spiders despite trying to act brave about them. They discussed books, discovering a shared love of adventure stories and a mutual dislike of overly sentimental novels. I tried to read one of those romance books once, Jacob admitted. Couldn't get past the first chapter. Everyone was sighing and swooning over nothing. "Oh, they aren't all bad," Margaret protested. "Some of them have quite good stories underneath all the melodrama, if you say so. I'll stick to my westerns and adventure tales." As evening fell, Margaret realized with surprise that she had barely thought about her scheduled position all day. She had been so caught up in getting to know Jacob, in the easy comfort of his company, that the desperate urgency that had driven her into the storm felt distant. That night, Jacob again insisted she take the bed while he slept by the fire. Margaret reluctantly agreed, though she felt guilty about displacing him in his own home. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the storm outside and the crackling fire within, she found her thoughts circling back to the man sleeping across the room. Jacob Garrett was not like anyone she had met before. He was quiet but not withdrawn, strong but not harsh, independent but not cold. There was a steadiness to him that she found deeply appealing. In just 2 days, she felt safer with him than she had felt in years. The realization troubled her. She barely knew this man. She had no business developing feelings for him. In a day or two, the storm would clear, and he would take her to the Whitmore Ranch where she would begin her new position. This was just a temporary shelter, nothing more. But as sleep claimed her, Margaret couldn't quite convince herself that was true. The second full day of the storm dawned with slightly clearer skies. The wind had died down enough that visibility improved, though snow still fell steadily. Jacob ventured out to check the barn and returned with the news that the worst seemed to have passed. "Should be clear enough to travel tomorrow morning," he said, brushing snow from his coat. "I'll hitch up the wagon and drive you to the Whitmore place. No sense risking you on horseback again." "That's very kind of you," Margaret said, surprised by the sinking feeling in her stomach. She should be relieved. Her future awaited her at the Whitmore Ranch. Instead, she felt an odd sense of loss. The day passed too quickly. Margaret helped Jacob with various tasks around the house, their conversation flowing easily. She learned he was planning to expand his herd in the spring, that he hoped to build an addition onto the house eventually, that he dreamed of having one of the most successful ranches in the territory someday. "You'll do it," Margaret said with conviction. "You have the determination and the intelligence. You'll build something remarkable here." Jacob looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You really believe that?" "I do. I can see it in everything you've done, everything you've built already." "You're going to succeed, Jacob Garrett." Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of feelings neither was quite ready to name. Jacob reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind Margaret's ear, his calloused fingers lingering against her cheek. "Margaret," he said softly, and her name on his lips sent warmth flooding through her. "I know we've only known each other a few days, but I need to tell you something." Her heart hammered. "What is it?" "I don't want you to go." The simple statement hung in the air between them. Margaret stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "What do you mean?" she whispered. Jacob took both her hands in his. "I mean I've never felt this way about anyone, not even Rebecca. These past 2 days with you, they've been the best days I can remember. You're smart and kind and brave, and when I think about you leaving, about never seeing you again, it feels like someone squeezing my heart in their fist." "Jacob," Margaret breathed, her own emotions overwhelming her. "I feel the same way, but I have to take this position. I have no money, no prospects. I can't just stay here." "Why not?" "Because I can't impose on your kindness forever. You saved my life, you've given me shelter, but I can't be a burden to you." "You're not a burden." Jacob's grip on her hands tightened. "Margaret, I'm asking you to stay. Not as a guest or an imposition, but as something more. I know this is fast, probably too fast, but I also know what I feel. I'm falling in love with you." Tears sprang to Margaret's eyes. "I'm falling in love with you too, but Jacob, we've known each other 3 days." How can we possibly know this is real? Because in 3 days, you've made this house feel like a home instead of just a place I sleep. Because when I look at you, I see my future. Because when I think about you leaving, I know I'll spend the rest of my life regretting that I let you go." He paused, his brown eyes searching her face. "Stay, Margaret, give us a chance. We can court properly if you want, take things slow. I'll build you a proper bedroom off the main house for propriety's sake. But please stay." Margaret's mind raced. This was insane. She couldn't possibly make a life-altering decision based on 3 days and a storm. It was impractical and impulsive and completely unlike her usual cautious nature, and yet her heart was screaming yes. "What would I do here?" she asked, trying to think practically even as her emotions rioted. "I can't just live here indefinitely with no purpose. You could do whatever you want. Help me with the ranch if you're interested in that. Start a small school for the ranch families in the area. There are at least a dozen families within a 20-mile radius who would pay for proper education for their children, or anything else you dream of doing. I'm not asking you to be my servant or my cook. I'm asking you to be my partner in every way." "People will talk," Margaret said weakly. "People always talk. Let them. We'll do this properly. I'll court you like a gentleman, and when the time is right, I'll ask you to marry me. If you say yes, then we'll have the rest of our lives together. If you say no, I'll respect that, though it will break my heart." Margaret looked into Jacob's honest face, saw the hope and fear and love there, and made her decision. Perhaps it was reckless. Perhaps she would regret it. But for once in her careful, cautious life, she was going to take a leap of faith. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll stay." Jacob's face broke into a smile that transformed him, making him look younger and unbearably handsome. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and Margaret melted into his embrace. She could feel his heart beating against her cheek, rapid and strong. "You won't regret this," he promised. "I'll spend every day making sure of that." He tilted her face up and kissed her, gentle and sweet, a kiss full of promise and new beginnings. Margaret had never been kissed before, but she knew instinctively that this was right. Everything about Jacob felt right. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "I should ride into Hawthorne tomorrow and tell the Whitmores you won't be coming. Don't want them waiting for a governess who isn't arriving." "I should write them a letter explaining," Margaret agreed. "And I need to collect my things from the boarding house. I don't have much, just a trunk with some clothes and books. We'll go together in a few days once the roads are fully clear. I want to do this right, Margaret. I want everyone to know I'm courting you properly." Margaret smiled. "All right. Though I suppose we should discuss what proper courtship looks like when we're living under the same roof." Jacob chuckled. "I'll start building that addition tomorrow. In the meantime, you keep the bedroom and I'll stay out here. We'll keep the door open during the day for propriety, closed at night for privacy. When we go into town, we'll make our intentions clear to everyone. No secrets, no shame. Just two people who found each other in a blizzard and decided to build something beautiful together." "That sounds perfect," Margaret said, and meant it. True to his word, Jacob began work on a small addition to the house the very next day. Despite the cold and the snow still blanketing everything, he started framing out a small bedroom that would extend from the side of the house. It would be cramped and basic, but it would provide the appearance of propriety that their situation required. Margaret helped where she could, holding boards steady while Jacob hammered, handing him tools, and making sure he took regular breaks to warm up by the fire. She marveled at his skill and determination. This was a man who knew how to build, how to create something from nothing through sheer will and hard work. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and continued getting to know each other. Margaret learned about Jacob's childhood. his complex relationship with his father, who had been a hard man to please, his close bond with his sisters, whom he missed terribly. Jacob learned about Margaret's lonely childhood after her mother's death, her struggle to hold her family together as her father's fortunes declined, her secret dream of someday having a real home and a family of her own. "You'll have that," Jacob promised, holding her hand as the firelight danced across their faces. "With me, if you'll have me." "I will," Margaret said. "I already know I will." A week after the storm, they made the trip into Hawthorne together. Jacob drove the wagon with Margaret beside him, their breath frosting in the cold air. The roads were still rough with packed snow, but passable. Hawthorne was a small but bustling town, the main street lined with shops and businesses that served the surrounding ranches and mining operations. Margaret directed Jacob to the boarding house where she had been staying, and together they collected her meager belongings. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house, raised her eyebrows when Margaret explained she would not be returning. "Moving out to the Garrett ranch, are you?" she asked, her tone suggesting scandal. "Mr. Garrett is courting me properly," Margaret said firmly. "We'll be married when the time is right." "Well," Mrs. Patterson sniffed, "that's quick work. You've known him barely more than a week." "Sometimes a week is all it takes to know," Jacob said, his voice pleasant but brooking no argument. "I appreciate you taking care of Miss Sullivan during her time here. How much does she owe you for the room?" Margaret started to protest that she would pay her own debts, but Jacob was already counting out money. Mrs. Patterson accepted it, her disapproval softening slightly in the face of ready cash. Next, they stopped at the general store where Jacob introduced Margaret to Mr. Hayes, the proprietor, and his wife. The Hayes were friendly and welcoming, congratulating them both and promising to spread the word of the courtship. "About time you found someone, Jake," Mr. Hayes said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Been too long on that ranch by yourself." They posted a letter to the Whitmore family explaining Margaret's change in circumstances and apologizing for the inconvenience. Then Jacob insisted on buying Margaret a new winter coat, warmer and better quality than the threadbare one that had nearly failed her in the storm. "You need proper gear if you're going to survive Montana winters," he said when she protested the expense. "Besides, I want to buy things for you." "Let me take care of you, Margaret." The tenderness in his voice made her acquiesce. She chose a thick wool coat in deep blue, and Jacob's eyes lit up when he saw her in it. "Beautiful," he murmured. "The color matches your eyes." They had dinner at the small restaurant in town, and Margaret was introduced to several more residents of Hawthorne. Word of their courtship spread quickly, and while there were a few raised eyebrows at the speed of things, most people seemed genuinely happy for Jacob. "He's a good man," more than one person told Margaret. "Decent and hardworking. You could do a lot worse." On the ride back to the ranch, Margaret felt a contentment she hadn't experienced in years. She had a place now, a purpose. More than that, she had Jacob, whose presence beside her felt as natural as breathing. "Happy?" Jacob asked, glancing at her with a smile. "Very," Margaret confirmed. "Thank you for today, for all of this." "Nothing to thank me for. This is what courting looks like. I want everyone to know you're mine, that my intentions are honorable." "I'm yours," Margaret repeated softly, liking the sound of it. "And you're mine." "Always," Jacob promised. The weeks that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Jacob finished the small addition, though they both knew it was more for appearances than actual use. Margaret made the house truly comfortable, adding small touches that transformed it from a bachelor's dwelling into a real home. She sewed curtains for the windows, organized the kitchen more efficiently, and arranged the books on the shelves by subject. In the afternoons, she began working on a curriculum for the small school she hoped to start in the spring. Jacob had been right about the need. Several ranch families in the area had children who received little to no formal education. Margaret sent letters to them all, proposing a small school that would meet 3 days a week. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Jacob was endlessly supportive, offering to help build a small schoolhouse on their property, suggesting ways to make the venture work. His belief in her abilities and dreams made Margaret fall more deeply in love with him every day. Their courtship progressed steadily. Jacob was always respectful of propriety, but there were stolen kisses by the fire, long conversations that stretched late into the night, and a growing intimacy that went beyond the physical. They learned each other's habits and preferences, their hopes and fears. They discovered how to work together, how to compromise, how to be partners in every sense of the word. Christmas came, and Jacob surprised Margaret with a beautiful leather-bound journal for her teaching notes. She gave him a warm scarf she had knitted in secret, working on it whenever he was outside with the livestock. They celebrated quietly, just the two of them, but it was the best Christmas Margaret could remember. They cooked a special dinner together, sang carols by the fire, and ended the evening wrapped in each other's arms, watching the snow fall outside the frosted windows. "I love you," Jacob said as midnight approached, his voice soft and serious. "I know I've said it before, but I need you to know how much I mean it. You've changed everything for me, Margaret. You've made me believe in happiness again." "I love you too," Margaret replied, cupping his face in her hands. "More than I thought possible." "You saved my life in more ways than one," Jacob Garrett. He kissed her then, deep and passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. In January, Jacob proposed properly. He had ridden into Hawthorne secretly and purchased a simple gold ring with a small diamond. On a clear, cold evening with stars blazing overhead, he led Margaret outside and dropped to one knee in the snow. "Margaret Sullivan," he said, his breath frosting in the air, "will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, and the love of my life?" "Yes," Margaret said through happy tears. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Jacob slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and spun her around, both of them laughing with pure joy. They kissed under the stars, the Montana winter cold around them but warmth flooding through them both. They were married in February in a small ceremony at the church in Hawthorne. Jacob's sisters made the long journey from California for the wedding, and Margaret was touched by their warm welcome into the family. The townsfolk turned out to celebrate with them, and even Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house admitted they made a handsome couple. Margaret wore a simple white dress that Jacob's sisters had helped her make, and Jacob wore his best suit, looking so handsome that Margaret's breath caught when she saw him waiting for her at the altar. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob kissed Margaret with such tenderness and love that several women in the congregation sighed. The celebration afterward was loud and joyous, with music and dancing and more food than seemed possible for such a small town to produce. Margaret danced with Jacob until her feet ached, his arms strong around her, his eyes never leaving her face. "Happy, Mrs. Garrett?" he asked as they swayed to a slower song. "Happier than I've ever been," Margaret confirmed. "Though it's strange to think that a few months ago I was lost in a blizzard, certain I was going to die. And now you're stuck with me for the rest of your life," Jacob teased. "Best fate I could have asked for," Margaret said, and kissed him as their friends and family cheered around them. That night, for the first time, Margaret slept in Jacob's arms in the bed they would now share as husband and wife. Their lovemaking was tender and sweet, a physical expression of the emotional bond they had forged. Afterward, wrapped in quilts with snow falling softly outside, Margaret felt a peace and contentment she had never imagined possible. "I was so scared that day in the storm," she murmured against Jacob's chest. "But now I think maybe I was meant to get lost. Maybe fate was guiding me here to you." "If that's true, then fate did me the biggest favor of my life," Jacob replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Sleep, my love. We have the rest of our lives ahead of us." Spring arrived with an explosion of wildflowers across the prairie. Margaret's school opened in April in the small building Jacob had built on their property. 6 families sent their children, 12 students in all ranging in age from 6 to 14. Margaret threw herself into teaching with passion and joy, finally able to use the education her mother had given her to help others. The ranch prospered too. Jacob's cattle multiplied, and he sold several head at good prices in town. He hired 2 permanent ranch hands, brothers named Tom and Peter, who built a small bunkhouse for themselves and proved to be hardworking and reliable. Margaret discovered she was pregnant in late spring. The morning she told Jacob, he picked her up and spun her around despite her laughing protests. "We're having a baby," he kept saying, his voice filled with wonder. "We're going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Margaret asked, though his joy was obvious. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Jacob said, his hand moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "You've given me everything, Margaret. A home, a purpose, and now a child. I'm the luckiest man alive." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Margaret continued teaching through the summer, though she had to stop when fall arrived and her belly grew too large for comfort. The ranch wives rallied around her, sharing advice and hand-me-down baby clothes, welcoming her fully into their community. Jacob was impossibly attentive, refusing to let Margaret do any heavy work and constantly fretting over her health. She found his concern endearing, though occasionally exasperating. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she would remind him with an amused smile. "I don't care. I'm not taking any chances with you or our baby." Their son was born on a cold December night, almost exactly 1 year after Margaret had first stumbled onto Jacob's ranch. The labor was long and difficult, but when Margaret finally held her baby boy, every moment of pain was forgotten. "He's perfect," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she counted tiny fingers and toes. Jacob sat beside her on the bed, one arm around her shoulders, staring at their son with open wonder. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but never settled on one. Now, looking at their son's tiny face, Margaret knew immediately. "James," she said. "After my father, James Henry Garrett." "James Henry Garrett," Jacob repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Welcome to the world, James." The baby yawned hugely, making them both laugh through their tears. Those early months of parenthood were exhausting but joyful. Jacob proved to be a devoted father, rising in the night to help with the baby, changing diapers without complaint, and spending hours simply watching his son sleep. "I never knew I could love anyone as much as I love you," he told Margaret one night, "but this little fellow comes pretty close." Margaret smiled, nursing James while Jacob sat beside them. "We made a good life, didn't we?" "The best life," Jacob agreed, "and it all started with a blizzard." The years that followed were full and rich. Margaret's school grew as more families settled in the area. Jacob's ranch expanded until it was one of the most successful in the region. They added onto the house several times, creating a spacious home filled with laughter and love. 2 years after James was born, they welcomed a daughter they named Emma Rose. She had Margaret's blue eyes and Jacob's dark hair, a beautiful combination. 3 years later came another son, William Thomas, who was quieter than his siblings but no less loved. The house that had once been a simple bachelor's cabin became a true family home, always full of children's voices. the smell of fresh bread baking, and the sounds of life being lived to its fullest. Jacob's sisters visited when they could, and Margaret corresponded regularly with them, building the family connections she had lost when her father died. The ranch hands became like extended family, joining them for Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations. Through it all, Jacob and Margaret's love only deepened. They weathered challenges together, years when cattle prices dropped, a harsh winter that killed part of their herd, childhood illnesses that terrified them until their children recovered. But they faced everything as partners, their bond unbreakable. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jacob gave Margaret a beautiful locket with pictures of their 3 children inside. She gave him a watch that had belonged to her father, one of the few possessions that had survived the debt collectors. 10 years. Jacob marveled as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of orange and pink. The children were playing in the yard, their laughter floating on the evening air. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday you stumbled onto my ranch half frozen. Other times it feels like we've been together forever. Both are true in their own way, Margaret said, leaning her head on his shoulder. My life before you feels like a different person lived it. Everything real, everything that matters started that day in the blizzard. Do you ever regret it? Jacob asked. Staying here instead of taking that governess position. Sometimes I wonder if you would have been happier with a different life, an easier life. Margaret turned to face him, taking his weathered hands in hers. Jacob Garrett, I have never regretted a single moment with you. You gave me everything I ever dreamed of and so much more. This ranch, our children, our life together, it's more than I ever imagined possible. I wouldn't trade it for anything. I love you, Jacob said, pulling her close. More every day if that's possible. It's possible, Margaret assured him, because I feel the same way. They sat together as the stars began to appear, the vast Montana sky opening up above them. Inside the house, they could hear their children starting to argue about something trivial, and they both smiled. I should go referee, Margaret said without moving. In a minute, Jacob replied. Let's just stay here a little longer, just us. Margaret settled back against him, perfectly content. 20 years ago, she had been a desperate young woman with nothing but debt and heartache. Now she had everything. A loving husband, beautiful children, a home that was truly hers, and a community that had embraced her. All because she had gotten caught in a blizzard miles from town. All because a rancher had become her shelter and her home. The years continued to roll by with the steady rhythm of ranch life. James grew into a tall, serious young man who shared his father's love of the land and the cattle. He took to ranch work naturally, learning everything Jacob could teach him about running a successful operation. Emma proved to be brilliant with numbers, keeping the ranch's books from the age of 12 with an accuracy that impressed even the bank manager in town. She also inherited her mother's love of teaching and often helped in the schoolhouse during busy seasons. William was the artist of the family, always drawing or carving wood into intricate shapes. At first, Jacob worried this meant his youngest son wouldn't be interested in ranch life. But William proved him wrong by designing more efficient barn layouts and livestock management systems. Margaret continued teaching until all 3 children were grown, educating 2 full generations of ranch children. When she finally retired, the community held a celebration in her honor, with former students coming from as far as 50 miles away to thank her for the education that had changed their lives. Jacob expanded the ranch steadily over the years, eventually employing a dozen full-time hands and running one of the largest herds in Montana. He never forgot his humble beginnings, though, and was known throughout the territory as a fair employer and an honest dealer. They faced sorrows, too. Jacob's father passed away, and though their relationship had been strained, Jacob mourned him. One of their ranch hands was killed in a riding accident, leaving a widow and children that Jacob and Margaret helped support until they could manage on their own. There were droughts and harsh winters, market crashes and difficult seasons. But through everything, they had each other. On their 25th anniversary, their children threw them a surprise party. Half the territory seemed to show up, filling the ranch house and spilling out into the yard. There was music and dancing, speeches and laughter, and a tremendous amount of food. Speech. Someone called out, and soon everyone was chanting for Jacob to say something. He stood reluctantly, never comfortable being the center of attention, and pulled Margaret up beside him. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, "but I'll say this. 25 years ago, Margaret Sullivan came into my life during the worst blizzard I'd ever seen. She was half frozen and completely lost, and I thought I was just saving a stranger's life." He turned to look at Margaret, his eyes bright with emotion. "Turns out she was saving mine. Every day since then has been a gift. She made a house into a home, a lonely rancher into a husband and father, and a simple life into something extraordinary. I love you, Margaret Garrett, more today than yesterday and less than tomorrow." There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd as Margaret kissed him, applause and cheers erupting around them. "I love you too," Margaret said through happy tears, "though I think we saved each other." "Fair enough," Jacob agreed, and kissed her again as their children, grandchildren, and friends celebrated around them. As evening fell and the party continued, Margaret found a quiet moment to step out onto the porch alone. She looked out over the ranch, at the neat fences and sturdy buildings, at the grazing cattle and the mountains beyond. The schoolhouse stood silent now that she had retired, but she could still hear the echo of children's laughter from all the years of lessons. She thought about that terrified young woman who had nearly frozen to death, who had been so desperate for security that she was willing to work for strangers far from town. She could hardly believe she had ever been that person. Strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind, and she leaned back against Jacob's familiar warmth. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How far we've come," Margaret said. "How much has changed since that first day." "Best blizzard of my life," Jacob said, making her laugh. "Mine too," Margaret agreed. She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to cup his face. His hair was graying now, and there were lines around his eyes and mouth, but to her he was just as handsome as the day he had pulled her from that storm. "Thank you for everything, Jacob. For saving me, for loving me, for building this beautiful life with me." "Thank you for saying yes," Jacob replied, "for taking a chance on a lonely rancher, for staying." "I'll always stay," Margaret promised. "This is where I belong, with you." They stood together on the porch as the party continued inside, the sounds of their children and grandchildren creating a joyful symphony. The Montana sky stretched endlessly above them, stars beginning to appear in the deepening twilight. Margaret thought about destiny, about the random chance that had led her into that blizzard on that particular day. She thought about all the tiny decisions and circumstances that had brought her to Jacob's ranch instead of anywhere else. It seemed impossible that it had all been mere coincidence. Perhaps she really had been meant to get lost in that storm. Perhaps fate had known that she and Jacob belonged together, that they would build something beautiful from that desperate beginning. Or perhaps it didn't matter why or how they had found each other. What mattered was that they had, and they had chosen to build a life together. "What are you smiling about?" Jacob asked. "Just happy," Margaret said simply. "Just grateful." "Me too," Jacob said and kissed her temple gently. "Every single day." The years turned into decades. James married a lovely girl from town and took over the day-to-day running of the ranch, allowing Jacob to slow down a bit. Emma married a banker and moved to Helena, though she visited often with her own children. William surprised everyone by marrying another artist, and together they opened a shop in Hawthorne selling furniture and carvings that became famous throughout the territory. Grandchildren came in abundance, filling the ranch house with laughter and chaos during visits. Jacob built a swing on the big oak tree in the yard, and there was always a child or two flying high on it, their squeals of delight carrying on the wind. Margaret and Jacob settled into a comfortable old age together. They still took rides around the property when weather permitted, still sat on the porch in the evenings watching the sunset. Their bodies slowed down, but their love never did. On their 40th anniversary, they renewed their vows in a simple ceremony at the ranch with just family present. Their children and grandchildren stood witness as they repeated the promises they had made 4 decades earlier. "I still choose you," Jacob said, his voice wavering slightly with age but strong with conviction. "Every day for the rest of my life I choose you." "And I choose you," Margaret replied, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "My shelter, my home, my love." They were in their 60s now, their hair silver, their hands marked by decades of hard work. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the people they had been that first day. The desperate young woman and the lonely rancher who had found each other in a blizzard. One spring evening, 50 years after that fateful storm, Margaret and Jacob sat on the porch swing they had installed years earlier. Margaret was knitting a blanket for their newest great-grandchild, while Jacob whittled a small wooden horse as a gift for one of their great-grandsons. "Do you remember what today is?" Margaret asked suddenly. Jacob looked up, thinking. "Thursday. It's been exactly 50 years since the day we met," Margaret said softly. 50 years since I got lost in that blizzard." Jacob set down his whittling and reached for her hand. 50 years. Half a century. Sometimes it feels like no time at all, and sometimes it feels like I've known you my whole life. "We've been so blessed," Margaret said, looking out over the ranch. Some things had changed over the decades, new buildings and improvements, but the fundamental heart of it remained the same. 3 children, 8 grandchildren, 4 great-grandchildren so far, and this beautiful place we built together. "You know what I'm most grateful for?" Jacob asked. "What?" "That I happened to be in the barn that day. That I looked out and saw a horse struggling through the snow. 5 minutes earlier or later, and I might have missed you entirely. You could have died out there or found shelter somewhere else or ended up at a different ranch. We might never have met at all." Margaret shivered despite the warm evening. "I try not to think about that, about how close I came to dying or to missing out on this life." "But you didn't," Jacob said firmly. "You survived. You found me or I found you, and we built something beautiful. That's what matters." "You're right," Margaret agreed. She set down her knitting and leaned her head on Jacob's shoulder. "Tell me you love me." "I love you," Jacob said immediately. "More than my own life. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Margaret Garrett." "And you are mine," Margaret replied. "My rancher, my shelter, my home." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching as the sun set over the Montana prairie they both loved. 50 years of memories surrounded them. Laughter and tears, triumphs and struggles, ordinary moments and extraordinary ones. It had been a good life, a beautiful life, built on a foundation of love that had never wavered. "You think we'll have another 50 years?" Margaret asked, only half joking. Jacob chuckled. "I don't know about 50, but I'll take as many as God gives us, and I'll love you for every single day of them." "Promise?" Margaret asked. "Promise," Jacob confirmed and sealed it with a kiss. The summer of their 53rd wedding anniversary, Jacob fell ill. It started as a simple cough but rapidly worsened into pneumonia. The doctor came from town, but there was little he could do. At 77, Jacob's body simply didn't have the strength to fight it off. Margaret barely left his bedside. She held his hand, read to him, told him stories of their life together. Their children and grandchildren came to say goodbye, the house full of family just as it had always been. On a warm August evening, with Margaret holding his hand and surrounded by his family, Jacob Garrett closed his eyes for the last time. "I love you," were his last words, whispered to Margaret. "Wait for me. I'll find you again." "I'll be waiting," Margaret promised through her tears. "I'll always wait for you." The funeral was the largest Hawthorne had ever seen. Jacob had touched so many lives over his years, had been a pillar of the community, a successful rancher, a devoted family man. People came from across the territory to pay their respects. Margaret bore it all with quiet dignity, though inside she felt like a piece of her soul had been torn away. For 53 years, Jacob had been her partner in everything. Now she had to face life without him, and she wasn't sure how. Her children wanted her to move to town to live with one of them where they could take care of her, but Margaret refused. "This is my home," she said firmly. "Your father and I built it together, and I'm not leaving it. He's here, in every board and nail, in every blade of grass. I'll stay where I can feel him close." So she remained at the ranch, with James and his family living in the main house to ensure she was never truly alone. She kept to the routines she and Jacob had established over the decades: morning coffee on the porch, afternoon walks around the property, evenings on the porch swing. People worried she was lonely, but Margaret didn't feel alone. She felt Jacob's presence everywhere. In the house he had built, the land he had tended, the family they had raised together. She talked to him sometimes, telling him about the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, about the ranch that James was running so well, about the small happenings of her days. She lived for 4 more years after Jacob's death, years filled with love from her family but shadowed by the absence of her husband. She never regretted staying at the ranch, though. It kept her connected to him in a way that nowhere else could have. On a cold December evening, almost exactly 57 years after that first blizzard, Margaret Sullivan Garrett went to sleep in the bed she had shared with Jacob for over half a century. She dreamed she was young again, lost in a blizzard, cold and scared and alone. But then strong arms wrapped around her and a familiar voice said, "I've got you. You're safe now." She looked up to see Jacob as he had been when they first met, young and strong, his brown eyes filled with warmth and love. "You waited," she said wonderingly. "Of course I did," Jacob replied. "I promised I'd find you again. Ready to go home." "I'm already home," Margaret said, taking his hand. "Wherever you are is home." And together they walked into the light. Margaret's funeral was held on a surprisingly clear December day, the winter sun shining bright on the snow-covered ranch. She was buried beside Jacob under the big oak tree where they had watched countless sunsets together. Their gravestone was simple, bearing just their names, dates, and a single line: "Together in life, together in death, together for eternity." The ranch remained in the family, passed down through the generations just as Jacob and Margaret would have wanted. The house they built stood strong, sheltering their descendants the way it had once sheltered a desperate young woman caught in a blizzard. And sometimes, on winter evenings when the snow falls soft and steady, people swear they can see 2 figures sitting on the porch swing. A tall man with dark hair and a woman in a blue coat, holding hands and watching the sunset just as they did for 53 beautiful years. The Garrett Ranch thrived under each new generation. James proved to be just as capable a rancher as his father, and his children after him carried on the tradition. But they never forgot the story of how it all began, the tale passed down through the family like a treasured heirloom. "Your great-great-grandmother nearly died in a blizzard," parents would tell their children. But your great-great-grandfather saved her, and they built all of this together. Everything we have, everything we are, comes from their love and hard work. The schoolhouse Margaret had started eventually became an official district school, serving the community for generations. A plaque by the door honored her as the founder, and children learned to read and write in the building that stood as a monument to her dedication to education. In Hawthorne, the Garrett name became synonymous with integrity and community service. Margaret and Jacob's descendants continued their legacy of hard work and generosity, always remembering the values the founding couple had instilled. The original house, carefully preserved and maintained, eventually became a family museum of sorts. Margaret's teaching materials were displayed in glass cases. Jacob's first saddle hung on the wall. Photographs spanning decades showed the family growing and changing, always anchored by the love of two people who had found each other in a storm. The bed where they had slept for over 50 years, where their children had been born, remained in its place in the bedroom. Visitors to the house often reported feeling a sense of peace in that room, as if the love that had filled it for so long had soaked into the very walls. On the fireplace mantel sat Margaret's leather-bound journal and Jacob's old pocket watch, placed side by side. They had become symbols of the family's origin story. The teacher and the rancher, the woman who had been lost and the man who had found her, two souls who had recognized each other instantly and chosen to build something beautiful together. Every December, on the anniversary of that first blizzard, the Garrett family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. It had become tradition to tell the story again, to remember how it all began. The eldest family member present would stand before the fireplace and recount the tale, the desperate journey, the blinding storm, the miraculous rescue, the love that had bloomed from it. "Never forget," they would say at the end, "that our family was built on courage and love." Great-great-grandmother Margaret was brave enough to take a chance on a new life. Great-great-grandfather Jacob was kind enough to offer shelter to a stranger, and together they were strong enough to build something that has lasted for generations. That is our heritage. That is who we are. The youngest children would listen wide-eyed, imagining that terrifying storm and the dramatic rescue. The teenagers would roll their eyes but secretly feel moved by the romance of it. The adults would exchange knowing glances, understanding better with each passing year what a miracle it was that Margaret and Jacob had found each other. And somewhere, perhaps in the wind that whistled around the eaves of the old ranch house, or in the crackle of logs in the ancient fireplace, the spirits of Margaret and Jacob Garrett smiled. Their love had created not just a family, but a legacy. Their chance meeting in a blizzard had rippled out across time, touching hundreds of lives, creating a dynasty built on the simple foundation of two people who had chosen to love each other completely. The ranch still stood strong more than a century after that fateful storm. The town of Hawthorne had grown but maintained its character. And on winter evenings, when snow fell soft across the Montana prairie, people still told the story of the rancher and the lost woman who had become his shelter and his home, just as he had been hers. It was a story of survival and chance, of courage and love, of two people who had found each other in the worst circumstances and created the best life. It was a story that reminded everyone who heard it that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from the most unexpected places, that love can bloom even in the coldest storms, and that home isn't a place but a person whose hand you choose to hold through whatever weather life brings. Margaret Sullivan and Jacob Garrett had started with nothing but a blizzard in each other, but that had been enough, more than enough. It had been everything. And their love story, born in snow and wind, weathered by time but never diminished, lived on in every generation that followed, a testament to the enduring power of love, commitment, and two hearts that recognized each other as home.